History will mark February 18, 2026, as the day the Western-led global economic order effectively ended. On that date, representatives from 34 countries walked out of the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, flew to Beijing, and signed the Comprehensive Global South Trade Framework, a binding agreement establishing a $12 trillion trade bloc that operates on fundamentally different principles than the institutions the United States built after World War II. This wasn't a protest. This wasn't symbolic. This was 34 countries representing 2 billion people and 43% of global GDP formally declaring economic independence from the Western-dominated system. $12 trillion in combined GDP. That's larger than the combined economies of Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, and France. That's nearly equal to the entire United States economy. That's more economic power than the G7 commands collectively. And it just organized itself into a unified trade bloc with China at the center, while the United States was focused on domestic political battles and European debt crises. The Western media is covering this as a diplomatic embarrassment, another instance of developing nations complaining about global inequality. That's catastrophically missing the point. This isn't complaint, it's replacement. The 34 countries that walked out and signed the Beijing framework aren't asking for different treatment within Western-led institutions. They're building alternative institutions that don't require Western approval, don't use Western currencies as primary settlement mechanisms, and don't accept Western definitions of acceptable economic policy. Let me show you exactly who walked out, what they signed, why this represents an irreversible fracture in global economic governance, and what the implications are for Western economic power, the dollar system, and your personal economic future. Chapter 1. Who walked out and why? The 34 signatories to the Comprehensive Global South Trade Framework represent a carefully constructed coalition spanning every inhabited continent except Europe and North America. The composition is strategic, not random. The anchor economies are the obvious ones: China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia. These 5 countries alone represent $7 trillion in combined GDP and 1 billion people. They provide the economic weight and market scale necessary to make the bloc viable, independent of Western trade relationships. But the inclusion of middle-tier economies is what makes this genuinely transformative. Mexico, Argentina, Turkey, Egypt, Iran, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya represent an additional $8 trillion in GDP and 1 billion people. These countries aren't economic giants individually, but collectively they represent the fastest-growing consumer markets, the most dynamic manufacturing sectors, and the critical commodity producers outside the Western sphere. The final tier includes countries that are strategically positioned or resource-rich: Malaysia, Philippines, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Morocco, Algeria, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates. Combined GDP of approximately $5 trillion, but their inclusion isn't about current economic size. It's about controlling access to resources, geographic positions, and growth trajectories. Let me be specific about what this coalition controls. Approximately 67% of global oil reserves, roughly 71% of global natural gas reserves, about 89% of rare earth element production, approximately 76% of global lithium reserves, nearly 82% of global cobalt production, and roughly 64% of global agricultural commodity exports. This isn't a coalition of minor economies operating on the periphery of global trade. This is a coalition that controls the natural resources essential to modern industrial production, the labor forces necessary for manufacturing, and the consumer markets that will drive global economic growth for the next 3 decades. Why did they walk out? The official statement cited irreconcilable differences over economic governance principles and the persistent refusal of Western-led institutions to accommodate the legitimate development needs of the global majority. That's diplomatic language obscuring deeper frustrations. The actual grievances are specific and long-standing. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank remain dominated by Western voting power, despite the fact that Western economies represent a shrinking share of global GDP. The United States retains veto authority over IMF decisions, despite representing only 24% of global GDP. European countries collectively control 29% of IMF votes, despite representing 22% of global GDP. This voting structure, determined in 1944 when Western economies dominated globally, hasn't been updated to reflect current economic reality. The dollar's role as global reserve currency creates what these countries view as an exorbitant privilege, where the United States can run persistent trade deficits and finance them by printing dollars that other countries need for international trade. This allows America to consume beyond its production, while other countries must maintain trade surpluses to accumulate dollars for trade settlement. Western sanctions regimes are applied unilaterally without global consensus, disrupting trade relationships between countries that have not agreed to participate in sanctions. When the United States sanctioned Iran, it pressured European and Asian countries to cease Iranian trade under threat of secondary sanctions. Countries that depend on Iranian oil or sold goods to Iranian markets had their trade relationships dictated by American foreign policy. The conditionality imposed by Western development financing requires economic reforms that these countries view as politically toxic and economically damaging. IMF loans typically require privatization of state enterprises, reduction of subsidies, currency devaluation, and fiscal austerity. Countries that implement these conditions often experience economic contractions, social unrest, and political instability. These grievances have existed for decades. What changed is that China developed sufficient economic scale and alternative institutional infrastructure to make a viable alternative bloc possible. 10 years ago, walking out of Western institutions would have been economic suicide. Countries depended on Western capital, Western markets, and Western-controlled financial infrastructure. Now, Chinese capital can substitute for Western capital, Chinese markets can substitute for Western markets, and Chinese-led institutions can substitute for Western-controlled institutions. Chapter 2. What they signed. The Comprehensive Global South Trade Framework is a 217-page binding agreement that establishes the institutional architecture for a parallel global trading system. Let me walk through the core components. First, the trade settlement mechanism. Member countries agree to settle bilateral trade in their own currencies or in yuan rather than defaulting to dollar settlement. A Chinese company importing Brazilian soybeans pays in yuan. Brazil holds yuan and uses them to purchase Chinese manufactured goods. The cycle continues without dollars entering the transaction. For trade relationships where direct bilateral exchange isn't balanced, the framework establishes a multilateral clearing system administered by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Countries accumulate trade surpluses or deficits against the collective bloc rather than against individual trading partners. Imbalances are periodically settled through commodity deliveries, currency swaps, or yuan transfers rather than dollar transfers. This mechanism doesn't eliminate the dollar from global trade. It makes the dollar optional rather than necessary. For the 43% of global GDP represented by framework members, dollar settlement becomes a choice rather than a requirement. That optionality is the death of dollar dominance over time. Second, the Development Finance Corporation. The framework establishes a new multilateral development bank capitalized with $380 billion in committed capital, with China contributing $168 billion, India contributing $42 billion, Saudi Arabia contributing $38 billion, and other members contributing the remainder. This institution directly competes with the World Bank by providing infrastructure financing to member countries without the policy conditionality that Western institutions impose. If a member country wants to build a port, railway, or power plant, it can receive financing from the Development Finance Corporation without committing to privatization, subsidy reduction, or other structural reforms. The absence of conditionality is the critical difference. Western development banks argue conditionality ensures responsible use of funds and promotes economic reforms that improve long-term performance. The framework countries view conditionality as sovereignty infringement that allows Western powers to dictate domestic policy. The Development Finance Corporation prioritizes sovereignty over Western concepts of sound economic management. Third, the Trade Dispute Resolution Tribunal. Framework members agree to resolve trade disputes through a new tribunal rather than through the World Trade Organization dispute resolution mechanism. The tribunal consists of judges appointed by member countries, with each member having equal representation regardless of economic size. This creates parallel trade law adjudication outside Western-influenced institutions. If China and India have a trade dispute, they resolve it through the Framework Tribunal rather than WTO. If Brazil and Indonesia have a dispute, same process. The WTO becomes irrelevant for intra-framework trade, which represents trillions of dollars in annual commerce. Fourth, the Technology Transfer and Development Accord. Framework members agree to pool technological knowledge and reduce enforcement of intellectual property restrictions for intra-framework technology sharing. A pharmaceutical company in India can produce patented medicines developed by a Chinese company without licensing fees. A Brazilian agricultural technology company can use Indonesian farming techniques without royalty payments. This is direct assault on Western intellectual property protections. American and European companies spent decades building legal frameworks that protect patents, copyrights, and trademarks globally. The framework creates a zone where those protections are weakened or non-existent for technologies shared between member countries. Fifth, the Infrastructure Investment Coordination Protocol. Framework members commit to prioritizing trade with other members for infrastructure development. If Indonesia needs to build a highway, the Framework Protocol requires Indonesian government to consider bids from framework member companies before accepting bids from non-member companies. If Egypt needs a power plant, same priority system applies. This preference system directs infrastructure spending toward framework member companies, creating a protected market for Chinese, Indian, and other member country firms while excluding Western companies unless they can underbid protected competitors. The sum of these 5 components creates a self-contained trading system that can function independently of Western institutions, Western currencies, and Western rulemaking. It doesn't need to destroy Western institutions to succeed. It just needs to create viable alternatives that member countries prefer, and preference is built into the framework through structural advantages for member-to-member trade. Chapter 3, the dollar system fracture. Now let me show you what this framework does to dollar dominance and why it's probably irreversible. The dollar's role as global reserve currency provides the United States with 3 massive advantages. First, constant demand for dollars to conduct international trade allows the U.S. to run persistent trade deficits without currency collapse. Second, dollar demand allows the U.S. government to borrow at lower interest rates than fundamentals would justify. Third, dollar centrality in global finance gives the U.S. government surveillance capabilities and sanctions leverage over global transactions. The framework erodes all 3 advantages simultaneously by creating a trading zone where dollar usage is optional. Start with trade deficits. The United States imports approximately $9 trillion in goods and services annually and exports approximately $1 trillion, creating a trade deficit around $800 billion, according to Bureau of Economic Analysis data from 2025. That deficit is sustainable because foreign countries need dollars to conduct trade, so they accept dollars in payment and hold them rather than demanding immediate conversion to other currencies. But if 43% of global GDP can conduct trade without dollars, the pool of actors who need to accumulate dollars shrinks. Demand for dollars declines relative to supply. That creates downward pressure on dollar value over time. The numbers illustrate the magnitude. Framework countries represent approximately $37 trillion in annual trade, according to World Trade Organization data. If even 30% of that trade shifts from dollar settlement to yuan or bilateral currency settlement, that's 11. $1 trillion in annual trade volume that no longer generates dollar demand. To put that in perspective, total daily foreign exchange trading in dollars is approximately $6 trillion according to Bank for International Settlements data from 2024. Removing 11. $1 trillion in annual trade volume from dollar settlement reduces daily dollar trading by approximately $44 billion on average. That's a 0.7% reduction in daily dollar transaction volume. 0.7% doesn't sound dramatic, but foreign exchange markets operate on tiny margins where shifts of even 0.1% can trigger significant repricing. A persistent 0.7% reduction in transaction volume creates downward pressure that compounds over quarters and years. The pressure manifests through interest rates. If dollar demand declines, the U.S. government must offer higher interest rates on Treasury securities to attract buyers. Every 1% increase in Treasury yields costs approximately $340 billion in additional annual interest expense on the $34 trillion national debt. Treasury yields have already been rising from historic lows. 10-year Treasury yields reached 4.8% in January 2026 compared to 1.5% in 2020. That increase, approximately 3 percentage points, will cost over $1 trillion in annual interest expense once the entire debt stock rolls over at higher rates. If framework-driven dollar demand reduction forces an additional 1 to 2 percentage points of yield increase, interest expense could reach 1.6 to 1.9 trillion annually by 2030. $1.6 to $1.9 trillion in annual interest expense. That's more than current spending on Social Security. That's nearly triple current defense spending. That's a fiscal crisis that forces either massive spending cuts, massive tax increases, or inflation that erodes the real value of debt. The surveillance and sanctions capabilities erode even more dramatically. Dollar centrality in global finance means most international transactions pass through dollar correspondent banking, where U.S. authorities can monitor flows, freeze accounts, and block transactions. This is how American sanctions work. The U.S. government identifies sanctioned entities and instructs banks to refuse transactions involving those entities. But if framework countries conduct trade in yuan or bilateral currencies through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank's clearing system, those transactions never touch dollar banking. U.S. authorities have no visibility and no leverage. Sanctions become unenforceable because the target of sanctions can conduct trade through framework mechanisms. Iran demonstrated this dynamic already. Despite comprehensive U.S. sanctions, Iran maintained oil exports to China and India through bilateral currency arrangements and barter trade. As framework institutions formalize and expand these mechanisms, sanctions evasion becomes systematized rather than improvised. This is the fracture in dollar system that may prove irreversible. Once alternative settlement mechanisms exist at scale, countries have choices. They can use dollars and subject themselves to American surveillance and sanctions leverage, or they can use framework mechanisms and operate with more autonomy. Many will choose autonomy. Chapter 4, the trade flow redirection. Let me show you how this framework restructures actual trade flows and why Western companies are the losers. Currently, global trade flows are organized around Western markets as primary destinations and Western companies as primary intermediaries. A Vietnamese factory produces textiles that are sold to American retailers. A Chilean mine produces copper that is sold to European manufacturers. An Indonesian plantation produces palm oil that is sold through Western commodity traders. These flows generate profits for Western intermediaries, employ Western logistics companies, and require financing through Western banks. The framework redirects these flows to operate within the member coalition, cutting Western companies out of value chains. Here's a specific example. Indonesia produces approximately 46 million metric tons of palm oil annually, roughly 58% of global production. Historically, Indonesian palm oil was sold to European food companies and American consumer goods manufacturers through Western commodity trading firms like Cargill and Wilmar. Under the framework's trade coordination mechanisms, Indonesian palm oil producers prioritize sales to framework member countries. India, China, Pakistan, and Bangladesh collectively consume approximately 28 million metric tons of palm oil annually. If Indonesian producers direct their output to framework members first, Western buyers compete for residual supply at higher prices. The price differential matters enormously. Indonesian palm oil trading at $850 per metric ton in framework member transactions might trade at $1,050 per metric ton in Western markets, because Western buyers are competing for limited supply while framework members have preferential access. That $200 per metric ton differential on 28 million metric tons of redirected trade equals $6 billion in additional costs for Western food companies and consumer goods manufacturers annually. Those costs get passed to consumers through higher prices for products using palm oil, which includes most packaged foods. Multiply this dynamic across the commodities framework countries control: oil, natural gas, copper, lithium, cobalt, rare earths, rubber, coffee, cocoa, soybeans, wheat. The aggregate value of commodities, where framework countries represent majority production, exceeds $2 trillion annually. If trade preference systems redirect even 20% of that volume to prioritize framework member buyers, Western companies pay $840 billion in higher commodity costs annually. $840 billion in additional costs. That's inflationary pressure that central banks can't address through monetary policy because it's driven by structural changes in global supply chains rather than domestic demand conditions. The trade redirection also affects manufactured goods. Chinese factories historically produced consumer electronics, textiles, and machinery for Western markets. Framework trade coordination encourages Chinese factories to prioritize framework member markets where they face less competition and can capture higher margins. Brazil, Indonesia, India, and Nigeria represent rapidly growing middle-class consumer markets with combined population exceeding 8 billion people. As incomes rise in these countries, consumer demand for electronics, vehicles, and household goods grows exponentially. Chinese manufacturers can serve these markets within the framework system without competing against Western brands and without navigating Western trade restrictions. For Western companies, this means losing market access to the fastest-growing consumer markets globally. Apple, Samsung, General Motors, and Volkswagen compete in framework markets, but they compete against preferential treatment given to framework member companies. A Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer benefits from framework trade protocols that reduce tariffs and expedite customs clearance. A Western vehicle manufacturer faces standard treatment without preferences. Over time, market share in framework countries tilts toward framework member companies. Western firms maintain some presence but lose the growth opportunities that would have driven revenue expansion. Slower revenue growth means slower profit growth, which means lower stock prices and reduced returns for Western investors, including pension funds and retirement accounts. Chapter 5: The China Wins Dimension. This entire framework structure delivers overwhelming strategic advantage to Beijing across economic, political, and technological domains simultaneously. Economically, China becomes the central hub in a $12 trillion trading bloc. Yuan usage expands as the vehicle currency for intra-framework trade. Chinese banks provide the infrastructure for settlement and clearing. Chinese companies capture disproportionate shares of framework infrastructure investment and manufactured goods trade. The yuan internationalization that China has pursued unsuccessfully for 15 years through gradual liberalization suddenly accelerates through institutional arrangements that make yuan usage preferential for framework members. Yuan-denominated trade within the framework could reach $8 trillion annually by 2030, according to projections by the Asian Development Bank, compared to approximately $680 billion in 2025. That expansion creates network effects where more yuan usage makes yuan more useful, which encourages more yuan usage. Eventually, yuan becomes a genuine alternative to the dollar for a significant portion of global trade, even if it doesn't fully replace the dollar. Politically, China positions itself as leader of the global majority in opposition to Western dominance. The framework provides Beijing with a coalition of 33 other countries that align with Chinese positions on global governance issues. When votes occur in United Nations forums, China leads a bloc representing 2 billion people and can credibly claim to speak for the majority of humanity. This political positioning constrains Western ability to isolate China on issues like Taiwan, South China Sea disputes, or human rights. If the West attempts to pressure China through sanctions or diplomatic isolation, China responds through the Framework Coalition. 34 countries simultaneously criticizing Western pressure or refusing to participate in Western sanctions creates political costs that may deter Western action. Technologically, China gains access to framework member resources, labor forces, and markets for developing and deploying advanced technologies without Western interference. Chinese artificial intelligence companies can train models using data from 2 billion people across framework countries. Chinese biotechnology companies can conduct research in framework countries with fewer ethical restrictions than Western countries impose. Chinese renewable energy companies can deploy solar and wind projects across framework countries, generating revenues that fund further technology development. The framework creates a protected market where Chinese technology companies can achieve scale and refinement before competing in Western markets. This is the same strategy that allowed Chinese manufacturing to develop, protect the domestic market while building capability, then export once capability reaches parity or superiority. Western technology companies face the opposite dynamic. They're excluded or disadvantaged in framework markets through preferential treatment for Chinese competitors. They lose access to 43% of global GDP as a testing ground for new technologies. They face slower growth and reduced revenues that constrain their ability to invest in R&D. Chapter 6: What this means for Western economies. Let me bring this to implications for Western economic performance and your personal financial reality. The framework doesn't destroy Western economies. It reduces their growth rates, increases their costs, and diminishes their geopolitical leverage.